Margaret Hayes glanced at the clock above the cash register. 9:15. Her shift was supposed to end at 10, but with Jenny calling in sick again, she'd probably be here until midnight. Her feet throbbed in her old sneakers, the ones with the worn-out soles that she kept meaning to replace. But new shoes cost money, and money was something she never seemed to have enough of. She wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that evening, watching the rain streak down the windows of Rosie's diner. It had been pouring for hours now, the kind of cold November rain that seeped into your bones and made you want to curl up under a warm blanket. Most of the dinner crowd had already left, probably smart enough to get home before the weather got worse. The diner was nearly empty now. Just old Mr. Peterson in his usual spot by the window, nursing his third cup of coffee while doing a crossword puzzle, and a young couple in the back booth, so wrapped up in each other they hadn't noticed their food getting cold. Margaret had been working at Rosie's for almost 6 years now. It wasn't glamorous work, and the pay was barely enough to cover rent and bills, but it was honest. She knew every regular customer by name, knew how they liked their coffee, knew which ones would tip well and which ones would leave loose change. At 52 years old, she wasn't as quick on her feet as the younger girls, but what she lacked in speed, she made up for in kindness. That's what her mama had always taught her. Treat people right and the world treats you right back. Though lately, Margaret was starting to wonder if Mama had been wrong about that. The bell above the door jangled, and a gust of wind blew rain across the floor. Margaret looked up, ready to greet the new customer with her usual smile, but the words died in her throat. A man stumbled through the door, and he looked like he'd been through hell. His clothes were expensive, she could tell that much. A dark suit, the kind that probably cost more than she made in 3 months, but it was ruined now, covered in mud and torn at the shoulder. His hair, streaked with gray, was plastered to his head, dripping water onto the floor, but it was his face that made Margaret's heart skip. His eyes were hollow, distant, like he was looking at something far away that no one else could see. His hands were bleeding, knuckles scraped raw. He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly like he wasn't quite sure where he was or how he'd gotten there. Water pooled around his expensive leather shoes. "Sir," Margaret said softly, coming around the counter. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer right away, just stared at her like he was trying to remember how to speak. When he finally did, his voice was barely a whisper. "Coffee. Just coffee." He moved to the corner booth, the one farthest from the windows, and collapsed onto the worn vinyl seat. Up close, Margaret could see he was shaking, not just from the cold, but something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Cindy, the other waitress on duty, appeared at Margaret's elbow. She was 23 and always had her phone out, always complaining about something. "You're not seriously going to serve him, are you?" Cindy whispered, eyeing the man suspiciously. "Look at him. He's probably drunk or worse. He could be dangerous." Margaret looked at the man again. He had his head in his hands now, shoulders hunched. He didn't look dangerous to her. He looked broken. "He asked for coffee," Margaret said quietly. "So I'm going to bring him coffee. He doesn't even have a wallet. I saw his pockets empty. He can't pay. Then he can't pay." Margaret picked up the coffee pot and a clean mug. "I'll cover it." Cindy rolled her eyes. "You're too soft, Margaret. That's why you're always broke." Maybe that was true. Maybe Margaret was too soft. But she'd rather be broke and kind than rich and cruel. She'd seen what cruelty did to people. She'd lived through it when her husband got sick, when the medical bills piled up, when the insurance company found every excuse not to pay. She remembered the looks people gave them, like poverty was contagious. Like being poor meant being less than human. She wasn't going to be that person. Margaret brought the coffee to the corner booth and set it down gently in front of the man. He looked up at her, and she saw tears mixing with the rainwater on his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "You're welcome, honey." She noticed his bleeding knuckles again. "Let me get you something for those hands." She came back with the first aid kit they kept under the counter and a clean towel. The man didn't protest when she carefully cleaned the scrapes. His hands were still shaking. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" Margaret asked softly. "Do you need me to call someone?" He shook his head. "No phone. No wallet, nothing. What happened to you?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. "I don't know if I can explain it. I needed to walk, to think. I walked for hours in the rain. I don't even know where I am. Margaret glanced toward the windows. The storm was getting worse, lightning flashing in the distance. You're at Rosie's Diner, about 15 miles outside the city. Not much else around here except the highway and some old factories. The man nodded slowly, like this information meant something to him, like he'd been looking for a place exactly like this, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, somewhere to disappear. Something about that thought made Margaret's chest tighten with worry. When's the last time you ate? She asked. He shrugged. This morning, maybe, I don't remember. Wait here. Margaret went to the kitchen and made him a sandwich. Not the fancy kind they sometimes served, but the good kind. The kind she made for her daughter Lily when she was having a bad day. Turkey and cheese on fresh bread with a little mustard and crispy lettuce. She added some fries on the side and brought it out with a refill of his coffee. The man stared at the plate like he couldn't quite believe it was real. I can't pay for this, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't ask you to. I don't have anything. I told you. No wallet, no phone, no. I heard you the first time, Margaret said gently. And I'm telling you it's okay. Just eat. He looked at her for a long moment and something shifted in his expression. The hollow look in his eyes softened just a little. Like maybe, for the first time in hours or days or however long he'd been wandering in the rain, someone had treated him like a person instead of a problem. He picked up the sandwich with trembling hands and took a bite. Then another. Then he was eating like he hadn't seen food in days, like this simple meal was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Margaret left him alone to eat, going back to her other customers. Mr. Peterson needed a coffee refill. The young couple finally wanted their check. But she kept glancing back at the corner booth, at the mysterious man in the ruined expensive suit, and she wondered what could drive someone to walk alone in a storm like this with nothing but the clothes on his back. Outside, thunder rumbled across the dark sky and the rain fell harder. Inside Rosie's Diner, a broken man ate a simple sandwich, unaware that this moment, this small act of kindness from a tired waitress, was about to change everything. The man ate slowly, like he was trying to make the meal last forever. Margaret refilled his coffee twice more, and each time she noticed his hands were shaking a little less. The color was starting to come back to his face. Whatever darkness had been chasing him through that storm seemed to be loosening its grip, at least for the moment. Around 10:30, Mr. Peterson finally left, tipping his hat to Margaret on the way out like he always did. The young couple had been gone for an hour. It was just Margaret, Cindy, and the stranger now. The cook had already gone home, leaving just the cold sandwiches and whatever was left from the dinner shift. Cindy kept shooting nervous glances at the corner booth while she counted her tips at the register. Margaret knew what she was thinking, that the man was trouble, that any minute now he'd do something crazy or dangerous. But Margaret had been watching him this whole time, and all she saw was someone who was hurting in a way that had nothing to do with his scraped knuckles or rain-soaked clothes. She'd seen that look before. In her husband's eyes during those last few months, that look that said the pain inside was worse than anything the body could feel. The man finally pushed his empty plate away and looked up at Margaret as she approached to clear the table. "Thank you," he said, and this time his voice was stronger, steadier. "I don't know why you did that, but thank you," Margaret smiled. "Everyone needs a little kindness sometimes. You don't even know me. Don't need to know someone to treat them decent." He looked down at his hands, at the bandages she'd wrapped around his knuckles. "I should go. I've taken up enough of your time. Go where?" Margaret asked gently. "You said you don't have a wallet or phone. How are you getting home?" He stood up slowly, and for a moment she thought he might just walk back out into that rain and disappear the same way he'd appeared. But then he swayed slightly, grabbing the edge of the table to steady himself. The exhaustion hit him all at once. "I'll manage," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Margaret made a decision. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the tip money she'd made that night. $43. It wasn't much, but it was supposed to buy Lily's asthma medicine tomorrow. The prescription was $45, and Margaret had been $2 short, hoping maybe she'd find enough change in the couch cushions at home. But looking at this man, this stranger who seemed like he was barely holding on to whatever thread was keeping him in this world, Margaret knew what she had to do. She pulled out 2 20s and pressed them into his hand. "Take a cab," she said. "Get yourself home safe." The man stared at the money like she'd just handed him $1 million. I can't take this. Yes, you can. You're a waitress. You need this money, and you need to get home. Margaret closed his fingers around the bills. Please, just take it. It'll make me feel better knowing you're not walking around in this storm all night. His eyes filled with tears again, and for a moment Margaret thought he might break down completely right there in the diner. Instead, he took a shaky breath and asked, What's your name? Margaret. Margaret Hayes. Margaret. He repeated it like he was memorizing it, like it was something important he couldn't afford to forget. I won't forget this. I promise you, I won't forget. You don't owe me anything, honey. Just get home safe. That's all I ask. He nodded and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back one more time, looking at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude, yes, but something else too. Something that looked almost like hope. Then he was gone, disappearing into the rain and the darkness. Cindy appeared at Margaret's side immediately. Are you insane? You just gave that guy your tip money. He needed it more than I do. Margaret, you're always broke. You complain about bills every single day, and you just gave $40 to some random guy who's probably going to spend it on drugs or booze. Margaret didn't answer. She just started wiping down the booth where the man had been sitting. You know what? Cindy continued. This is why you're going to be stuck in this diner forever. Because you keep giving away money you don't have to people who don't deserve it. That stung a little, but Margaret knew Cindy didn't mean it cruelly. She was just young. She hadn't learned yet that sometimes the measure of a person isn't what they keep, but what they're willing to give away. Margaret finished her shift and drove home in her old car that made concerning noises whenever she went over 40 miles an hour. The rain had finally stopped, but the streets were flooded and she had to take the long way around to avoid the worst spots. She got home just after midnight. The apartment was dark and quiet. Margaret tiptoed to Lily's room and cracked open the door, just to check on her daughter like she did every night. Lily was 12 now, almost too old for these check-ins, but Margaret couldn't help herself. Lily was asleep, but her breathing was labored, wheezy. The inhaler on her nightstand was nearly empty. Margaret's heart sank. She'd been hoping they could stretch it one more day, but Lily was having a bad night. She closed the door softly and went to her own room, where she dumped out her purse on the bed and counted everything. $3.72. Not nearly enough for the medicine. She checked the kitchen jar where she kept emergency money. Empty. She'd used it last week to fix the car. Margaret sat on her bed and put her head in her hands. Maybe Cindy was right. Maybe she was a fool for giving that money away. What kind of mother chose a stranger over her own daughter's medicine? But even as she thought it, she knew she'd make the same choice again. Because the look in that man's eyes wasn't the look of someone who needed drug money. It was the look of someone who needed to remember that the world could still be kind, that people could still be good, that maybe life was worth living after all. Margaret lay down fully clothed, too tired to even change into her pajamas. Tomorrow she'd figure something out. She always did. Maybe she could pick up an extra shift. Maybe she could ask her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, for a small loan. Maybe she could call the pharmacy and see if they'd let her pay half now and half next week. Tomorrow. She'd figure it all out tomorrow. As she drifted off to sleep, she wondered where the stranger was now. If he'd made it home safely. If he was warm and dry. If maybe, just maybe, that simple meal and those $40 had made any difference at all. She'd never know that in that moment. Miles away in a cheap motel room, the man she'd helped was sitting on the edge of a bed, holding her $40 in his hands and crying. Crying because for the first time in months he didn't want to die. Crying because a tired waitress with worn-out shoes had reminded him that kindness still existed in the world. And crying because he'd finally remembered who he used to be, before the money and the power and the success had turned him into someone he didn't recognize anymore. But Margaret knew none of this. She just slept, exhausted and broke, never suspecting that this night would change everything. The days turned into weeks, and Margaret never saw the stranger again. She didn't really expect to. People passed through Rosie's diner all the time, especially folks from the highway. They came, they ate, they left, and that was that. Most of them she'd never see again. Life went on, and it didn't get any easier. Margaret managed to scrape together enough money for Lily's medicine by working a double shift on Saturday and Sunday. Her feet hurt so bad by the end of those weekends that she had to soak them in ice water, just to be able to walk the next day. But Lily could breathe easier, and that was all that mattered. Then December came, and with it more problems. The landlord slipped an eviction notice under her door on a Tuesday morning. Margaret stood in her tiny kitchen, still in her waitress uniform from the night shift, reading the words 3 times before they made sense. 60 days to pay 3 months of back rent or find a new place to live. $4,200. She might as well have owed $4 million. She'd been late on rent before, but Mr. Kowalski had always been understanding. Not anymore. He'd sold the building to some investment company, and they didn't care about understanding tenants. They cared about money. Margaret folded the notice carefully and put it in her purse. She'd figure something out. She had to. At work, things got worse. The owner of Rosie's Diner called a staff meeting on a Thursday afternoon. Margaret had a bad feeling as soon as she walked in and saw everyone's faces. Mr. Patterson, the owner, looked tired, old. He cleared his throat and told them what they already knew in their hearts. Business was down, way down. The new highway exit had diverted traffic away from their road, and the new chain restaurants were stealing what few customers they had left. He was going to have to let people go. Margaret's stomach dropped. She'd been there for 6 years. Surely that counted for something. But when Mr. Patterson read the names, hers was third on the list. Last hired, first fired, he said. Except that wasn't even true. Cindy had been hired after her and got to keep her job because she was younger, faster, better with the new computer system they'd installed. 2 weeks' notice. That was all she got. 2 weeks to find another job in a town where nobody was hiring. Margaret nodded, thanked Mr. Patterson for the opportunity, and went back to work. She didn't cry, not then. She'd learned a long time ago that crying didn't pay bills or put food on the table. You cried later, in the shower or in your car where nobody could see, not in front of people who needed you to be strong. That night, after Lily was asleep, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills. No matter how many times she added it up, the numbers didn't work. Even with unemployment, even if she found another job right away, she'd never make enough to cover the back rent and the eviction. They were going to lose their apartment. She thought about calling her sister in Ohio, but Linda had her own problems. 3 kids and a husband who just lost his job. Margaret couldn't add to that burden. She thought about shelters, about what it would do to Lily to have to leave her school, her friends, the only home she'd ever really known. For the first time in years, Margaret let herself think about giving up, not dying. Not like whatever had been chasing that stranger through the rain, but giving up on the idea that things would ever get better. Maybe this was just how life was going to be, an endless cycle of working yourself to death and still losing everything. She put her head down on the table and finally let herself cry. 2 months passed. January came with bitter cold, and the kind of gray skies that made you forget the sun existed. Margaret worked her final shifts at Rosie's, accepting the small severance check and the sympathy from customers who promised to miss her. She applied for jobs everywhere, fast food places, grocery stores, gas stations, anywhere that was hiring, but there were too many people looking for too few jobs, and at 52, she wasn't anyone's first choice. The eviction date got closer. Margaret started packing their things, trying to figure out what they could fit in her car and what they'd have to leave behind. Then, on a Wednesday morning in late January, something strange happened. Margaret was getting ready to take Lily to school when she heard the sound outside. A deep, expensive purr of engines that didn't belong in her neighborhood. She looked out the window and froze. 3 black SUVs were parked in front of her building, the kind of vehicles that either meant someone very important or someone very dangerous. Margaret's first thought was that the investment company had sent people to force them out early. But then the doors opened, and people in business suits stepped out, professional, polished, and leading them, walking straight toward her building, was someone she recognized, the stranger from the diner. But he didn't look anything like the broken man who'd stumbled through the door on that rainy November night. This man was clean-shaven, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her car. He moved with purpose, with authority. He looked like someone who owned the world. Margaret's heart started pounding. She didn't understand what was happening. Why was he here? How did he even know where she lived? There was a knock on her door, firm but polite. She opened it slowly, and there he was, up close, real, looking at her with the same eyes, but everything else about him was different. Behind him stood 3 other people, all holding briefcases and tablets. all looking very serious. "Hello, Margaret," he said quietly. She just stared at him, unable to find words. "I'm sorry for showing up like this. Unannounced. I know it must be strange." He paused, and she could see he was nervous. Actually nervous despite all the expensive clothes and professional entourage. "May I come in? I need to talk to you." Margaret glanced back at Lily, who was watching from the kitchen with wide eyes. "I have to take my daughter to school. I can wait. Or I can have my driver take her if that's all right with you. We really need to talk." Something in his voice made Margaret nod. She called Lily over, explained that the nice man was going to have someone give her a ride to school, kissed her goodbye, and watched as one of the professional-looking women escorted her daughter to one of the SUVs. Then she turned back to the stranger, this man who'd somehow transformed from broken to powerful in the span of 2 months, and she asked the question that was burning in her mind. "Who are you?" He took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. "My name is Richard Ashford. I own Ashford Global Industries. And that night at the diner when you gave me coffee and a meal and your tip money, I was planning to kill myself." The words hung in the air between them, and Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. "You saved my life, Margaret, and now I need to tell you why I'm here." Margaret stood frozen in her doorway, staring at the man who called himself Richard Ashford. The name meant nothing to her. She didn't follow business news or read about billionaires. But looking at him now, at the expensive suit and the confident way he carried himself, she understood that he was someone important. Someone powerful, and he was telling her that 2 months ago he'd wanted to die. "I don't understand," she finally managed to say. "Can I sit down?" Richard asked gently. "This might take a while." Margaret nodded and led him into her small living room. She was suddenly aware of how shabby everything looked. The couch with the torn armrest that she'd covered with a blanket. The water stain on the ceiling that the landlord never fixed. The boxes stacked in the corner, half packed for an eviction she couldn't stop. Richard sat down like none of that mattered. Like he was sitting in a palace instead of a rundown apartment. "That night," he began, "I'd lost everything that mattered to me. Not money. I had plenty of that. But my wife had died 6 months earlier. Cancer. We'd been married for 30 years. And suddenly she was just gone." His voice cracked a little, and Margaret could see the pain was still fresh. "My kids, they're adults now, living their own lives. After their mother died, they tried to be there for me, but I pushed them away. I'd spent so many years focused on building my company, making money, closing deals. I'd missed so much of their lives. And when I finally wanted them around, I realized I didn't know them anymore. They were strangers." Margaret sat down across from him, listening. "I built a company worth billions," Richard continued. "I had houses, cars, everything money could buy. But I was empty inside. Hollow. I started thinking about all the people I'd hurt to get where I was. The competitors I'd crushed. The employees I'd fired without a second thought. The corners I'd cut. I'd spent my whole life climbing to the top, and when I finally looked around, I realized I was completely alone up there." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had been bleeding and shaking that night. "So I made a plan. I wrote letters to my kids. I put my affairs in order, and then I got in my car and drove. I threw my phone in a river, tossed my wallet after it. I just kept driving and driving until I didn't know where I was anymore. I was going to find a bridge or a cliff, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could just disappear." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes. "But then I saw your diner," Richard said, looking up at her. "And I thought, one last coffee. One last moment of warmth before I ended it all. I honestly don't know what I was thinking when I walked in there. I had nothing to pay with. I looked like a homeless person. I must have looked crazy." "You looked lost," Margaret said softly. "I was lost. Completely lost." Richard's voice grew thick with emotion. "And then you brought me coffee. You didn't call the police. You didn't kick me out. You cleaned my hands and brought me food. And you gave me money you clearly couldn't afford to give. You treated me like I mattered, like I was worth something, when I'd spent hours convincing myself I wasn't." He wiped his eyes, and Margaret realized this powerful billionaire was crying in her living room. "I took that cab like you told me to. I got a motel room. And I sat there all night thinking about you, a waitress who had every reason to ignore me or be afraid of me. But instead you chose kindness. You chose to see me as a human being. And I realized that if someone like you existed in the world, someone who could give away their last $40 to a stranger, then maybe the world wasn't as dark as I thought. Maybe I'd just been living in the wrong parts of it. Margaret didn't know what to say. She'd had no idea. She'd just seen someone who needed help. The next morning I checked myself into a hospital, started therapy, called my kids and actually talked to them. Really talked for the first time in years. I told them everything. About how I'd lost myself. About wanting to die. About the waitress who'd saved me. I didn't save you, Margaret protested. I just gave you coffee. You gave me more than coffee. You gave me back my humanity. Richard leaned forward. I spent the next 2 months working on myself, going to therapy every day, rebuilding my relationship with my children, and thinking about you, about what you'd done for me. I wanted to find you, to thank you, but I also wanted to make sure I was actually better, that I wasn't just going through the motions. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. And I wanted to figure out the right way to repay you. Margaret held up her hand. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. You gave me everything when you had almost nothing. Let me do something for you. I don't want your money, Margaret said firmly, even though she could feel the eviction notice burning a hole in her purse across the room. What I did that night wasn't about getting paid back. I know that. That's exactly why I want to help you. Richard set the envelope on the coffee table between them. I had people look into your situation. I hope you don't think that's invasive, but I needed to understand your life. You're being evicted. You lost your job. Your daughter has medical bills. You're drowning in debt. Am I right? Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame. That's none of your business, and you're right. It's not. But I'm making it my business because you made me your business that night. Richard pushed the envelope toward her. This isn't just money, Margaret. It's an offer. I want you to come work for me. Margaret laughed, a short, bitter sound. Work for you? I'm a waitress. What could I possibly do for a billionaire? Help me start a foundation. A real one. Not the kind that's just for tax breaks. I want to help people who are struggling like you're struggling. Working families who can't catch a break. People drowning in medical debt. Single parents trying to keep a roof over their heads. But here's the thing. I don't know how to do that. I've spent my whole life in boardrooms and country clubs. I don't know what real people need. He looked at her intently. But you do. You've lived it. You know what it's like to choose between medicine and rent, to work yourself to exhaustion and still fall short. I need someone with your perspective, your heart, your honesty. I need someone who won't let me create another empty vanity project. Someone who'll tell me the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Margaret shook her head. I don't know anything about running a foundation. You know about people. You know about kindness. That's more valuable than any business degree. Richard stood up. The envelope has details. A salary offer, money to cover your back rent and your daughter's medical expenses, housing assistance while you get on your feet. All I'm asking is that you think about it. Why me? Margaret asked. Why not hire some expert? Because experts know how to run organizations. You know how to see people. And that night you saw me when I couldn't even see myself. That's the person I need. He walked to the door, then turned back. I'm not the same man who walked into your diner, Margaret. You changed me. Let me return the favor. Not because you need saving, but because together, maybe we can save a few other people who are say, ending where I was, where you are. Then he was gone, leaving Margaret alone with an envelope she was afraid to open and a choice she never expected to have to make. Margaret sat alone in her living room for a long time after Richard left, staring at the envelope on her coffee table like it might explode. Her hands were shaking. Part of her wanted to tear it open immediately. Part of her wanted to throw it away without looking inside. She made herself a cup of tea and sat back down. Then, with trembling fingers, she opened the envelope. The first page was a job offer. Director of Community Outreach for something called the Ashford Hayes Foundation. Hayes. Her last name. He'd named it after her. The salary made her gasp out loud. It was more than she'd made in 2 years at the diner. There was a signing bonus that would cover all her back rent, Lily's medical bills, and still leave enough for savings. Health insurance, a relocation allowance to help them move somewhere safe and clean. But it was the second page that made her cry. It was a handwritten letter from Richard. Margaret, I know you don't want charity. I understand that, because I wouldn't have wanted it either. But this isn't charity. This is partnership. I have money and resources. You have wisdom and compassion. I've spent my life building things that made money but didn't matter. Help me build something that matters. You don't owe me acceptance, but I owe you my life, and I'd like to spend what's left of it trying to be worthy of what you did for me. Whatever you decide, the money for your rent and Lily's medicine is yours. No strings attached. You gave me $40 when you needed it yourself. This is me paying back what I owe. Richard. Margaret put her head in her hands and sobbed. Not sad tears this time. Something else. Relief, maybe. Or hope. Or just the overwhelming weight of 2 months of fear and struggle finally lifting off her shoulders. When Lily came home from school that afternoon, Margaret sat her down and told her everything. About the stranger from the diner, about who he really was, about the job offer. Lily's eyes got wider and wider. Are you going to say yes? Lily asked. I don't know, baby. It's scary. What if I'm not good enough? What if I mess it up? Lily looked at her with those wise 12-year-old eyes. Mom, you help people every day. That's all you do. This is just helping more people, out of the mouths of children. Margaret called the number on the letter. A professional-sounding woman answered and scheduled a meeting for the next day. Margaret wore her best outfit, which wasn't very good, and drove to an office building downtown that was so fancy she almost turned around. But she didn't. She went inside. The next 3 weeks were a blur. Margaret met with Richard and his team. She toured facilities and met with lawyers and signed papers she barely understood. She was terrified the whole time, sure they'd realize. They'd made a mistake. That she was just a waitress who had no business being in these rooms with these important people. But Richard kept telling her that was exactly why she belonged there. My lawyers know law, he said. My accountants know money. But you know people. Don't ever forget that. Margaret started slowly. Richard gave her complete freedom to design the foundation's programs. Her first decision shocked everyone. She insisted on visiting people personally, not sending assistants or workers, actually going to their homes, sitting at their tables, hearing their stories. The first family she helped was a single father, with 3 kids who'd lost his job when the factory closed. She sat in his kitchen and listened to him talk about choosing between electricity and groceries, about his oldest son giving up college to work at a gas station, about feeling like a failure. Margaret didn't give him a lecture. She didn't make him fill out 100 forms. She just helped, paid his overdue bills, set up a scholarship for his son, connected him with job training programs, treated him with dignity. Word spread quickly. The foundation started getting requests from all over. People who'd been denied by every other charity, families drowning in medical debt, veterans who couldn't afford housing, teachers working second jobs just to survive. Margaret's approach was simple. Talk to people like they were people. Find out what they actually needed instead of assuming. Follow up to make sure the help was really helping. And never ever make anyone feel small for needing assistance. The fancy executives thought she was doing it wrong at first. Too slow, too personal, not scalable. But Richard backed her every time. This isn't about efficiency, he told them. It's about humanity. The foundation grew. Within a year, they'd helped over 3,000 families, not with handouts but with real solutions. Medical debt forgiveness, job training, education scholarships, emergency housing, mental health support. And Margaret learned something surprising. She was good at this. Really good. She had a gift for seeing what people needed and finding ways to help them. All those years of watching people in the diner, of understanding struggle, of knowing what it felt like to be invisible, it all meant something now. But the best part wasn't the work. It was watching Richard change. He came on visits with her sometimes. At first, he was awkward, not sure what to say to the families they helped. But Margaret taught him how to listen without trying to fix everything immediately, how to see the person behind the poverty, how to give help without taking dignity. She watched him reconnect with his children too. They started having dinner together every Sunday. His son told Margaret once that he'd gotten his father back and it was because of her. "I just gave him coffee," Margaret always said. But it was more than that, and she was finally starting to understand it. 5 years passed. Lily was 17 now, healthy and thriving, planning to study medicine in college on a scholarship from the foundation. Margaret had moved them into a small house with a yard. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. Safe, warm, home. The foundation had helped over 50,000 families. They'd expanded to 12 cities. But Margaret still insisted on meeting people face to face whenever she could. Still sat at kitchen tables and listened to stories. Still remembered what it felt like to be desperate and afraid. One evening in November, Margaret and Richard went back to Rosie's diner. It was still open, barely, but Mr. Patterson refused to take their money. The story of what happened had become local legend. They sat in the same corner booth where it all began. Outside it started to rain, just like that night. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped?" Margaret asked quietly. Richard was quiet for a moment. "Every day. And every day I'm grateful I walked through that door." "I'm glad you did too." "You know what's funny?" Richard said. "I spent 40 years building a company, making billions of dollars, thinking that was my legacy. But this," he gestured around, meaning the foundation, the lives they'd changed. "This is what I'll be remembered for. And it only exists because you gave a stranger a sandwich." Margaret smiled. "And $40. Don't forget the $40. "How could I forget? Best investment I never made." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee that wasn't very good but tasted perfect anyway. Margaret thought about that night 5 years ago, about the broken man who'd stumbled through the door, about the choice she'd made to help him, even when it cost her something she couldn't afford to give. She used to think kindness was something you did when you had extra time, extra money, extra energy. But she'd learned different. Real kindness happened when you gave anyway. When you looked at another human being and decided they mattered even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Outside, the rain fell steady and soft, washing the world clean. And inside Rosie's diner, 2 people sat together, living proof that one small act of kindness can change everything, not just for the person who receives it, but for the person who gives it too.